Castrated original revenge memoir with fresh characters, avoided banned names. Structured three-act narrative, or castrated original revenge memoir with fresh characters, avoided banned names. Structured three-act narrative. My name is Russell Doyle, I'm 68 years old, and for the past 2 years I've slept in the back bedroom of a house where I was treated like a boarder who'd overstayed his welcome. Last night, over a plate of food I wasn't allowed to touch, my daughter-in-law looked at me across the table and told me I had a choice. I could start pulling my weight the way she saw fit, cook, clean, keep quiet, stay out of the way, or I could pack up and go. I set down my fork and I smiled. Not a bitter smile. A real one. Then I went and got the canvas bag I'd carried on my honeymoon 41 years ago, and I left my key on the kitchen counter next to a stack of mail that wasn't even mine. They thought they'd finally won. What they didn't know was that the old man they'd just shoved out the door was the only person in 3 counties who could still save them from the hole they'd dug, and I had no intention of doing it. Before I tell you the rest, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever learned that walking away quietly can hit harder than any shout, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps an old man more than you'd think. It started in the kitchen, the way most of the worst things in a family do. My daughter-in-law, I'll call her Colleen because that's her name and I'm done pretending otherwise, had cooked some kind of chicken that smelled like nothing, boiled and beige. I'd made the mistake, earlier that afternoon, of frying up a little catfish in the garage on the hot plate I kept out there, the way my wife used to do it on Friday nights. Cornmeal and black pepper and a squeeze of lemon. The smell had drifted into the house. To me it smelled like every good memory I had left. To Colleen it smelled like an insult. "I can't have this," she said, not even to me, to my son. I have told him and told him. The whole house smells like a fish market. My son, Grant, my boy, my only child, the kid who used to fall asleep in my lap in the truck cab while I drove him to Little League, didn't look up from his plate. He just sort of sank into his shoulders, the way he'd been sinking for 2 years, getting smaller and smaller at his own dinner table. "Dad," he said finally, real quiet, "we've talked about this." "You talked about it," I said. "I've listened." That was the wrong thing to say. Colleen put her fork down with a little click and folded her hands like she was about to lead a meeting. "Russell," she said, she'd stopped calling me Dad a long time ago, and that was fine by me. "I'm going to be honest with you, because somebody has to be. This isn't working. You leave sawdust in the garage, you play that old music, you burn that grease in here like it's still 1975. You've got opinions about everything and you contribute to nothing." "Colleen," my son said, weak as dishwater. She held up a hand to him without looking. "No, he needs to hear it." Then she turned the full beam of those flat eyes on me. "So here's how it's going to be from now on. You want to keep living under this roof, you live by our rules. You cook what we eat, you clean what we tell you. You keep that garage spotless and you stop dragging it through the house. No more projects. No more lectures. You make yourself useful and you make yourself pleasant. Or you find somewhere else to be. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. I'll be honest with you. For about 3 seconds I felt the old familiar ache, the one I'd carried since the morning I woke up next to my wife, and she was already gone. 40 years of marriage, and in the long silence after, I felt the loneliness of it, and the sting of having that loneliness used against me. And then something happened that I didn't plan and couldn't have stopped if I'd tried. The ache just drained out of me. Like a tub when you finally pulled a plug. What was left was the calmest I'd felt in 2 years. So I smiled. I watched the confusion roll across both their faces, and I want to tell you that smile did more than any argument I could have made. Colleen had braced for a fight. She loaded for one. My son had braced to watch me lose it. Instead, I just set my napkin on the table, neat, like I was leaving a tip, and I said, "All right then, I'll leave it." I stood up. My knees popped, they always do, and I walked back to that little bedroom that had never once felt like mine. Under the bed I had a canvas duffel, olive green, soft at the corners from age. My wife, Maggie, and I had taken it to Gatlinburg the week we got married, 2 kids who couldn't afford a real suitcase. I pulled it out, and I didn't take much. I left behind every shapeless cardigan and elastic waist trouser Colleen had bought me to make me look like a man who'd given up. I took my one good suit, the navy one I'd worn the night the Tennessee Craftsman's Guild gave me the Mastery Award, back when my hands were the most respected hands in the trade for 200 miles. I took my roll of chisels, the German steel ones, worn to fit my grip, wrapped in their oilcloth so they wouldn't sing against each other. I took the little framed photo off the nightstand, Maggie in the churchyard in her yellow dress, squinting into the sun and laughing at something I'd said that I can't even remember now. I pressed my mouth to the cool glass and wrapped it in a flannel shirt and tucked it down deep where it couldn't shift. Took me about 10 minutes. When I zipped that bag shut, the sound of it was a door closing on a whole chapter. I rolled it out to the front hall. They were both still sitting there, frozen, like they'd been carved out of the same beige they'd been feeding me. The smugness was gone off Colleen's face. My boy looked stricken. "Dad." His voice cracked on the one word. "Dad, what are you doing? Where are you even going to go?" I set the house key on the hall table, real gentle, and I picked up my bag. "Somewhere," I said, "where a man frying fish his wife taught him to fry isn't committing a crime." And I opened the door and walked out into the cool of the evening and pulled it shut behind me, and the latch caught with a click. And I swear to you, it was the best sound I'd heard in 2 years. I drove out to a motel off the highway, the kind with a buzzing sign and a coffee maker bolted to the wall. The girl at the desk didn't look up from her phone. Took my card, slid me a key, room 219, didn't ask me a single thing about myself. And you know what? After 2 years of being a problem somebody had to manage, being nobody at all felt like a vacation. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarettes somebody had smoked through a closed window. The bedspread had a pattern designed to hide stains. I sat down in one chair by the window and I didn't turn on the TV. I just looked out at the parking lot, the trucks pulling in and out, the gas station glowing across the road, and for the first time the full weight of the thing landed on me. I'd left a house. But the truth I'd been hiding from for 2 years sat right down next to me in that ugly chair. I hadn't had a home since the day I buried my wife. Home wasn't a building. Home was the smell of her hair when she came in from the garden. Home was the dent in the kitchen floor where we'd danced too hard to a Sam Cooke record one New Year's Eve. That son's house with its gray walls and its silent judgment and its boiled chicken, that was never home. It was a waiting room with nice fixtures, and I was finally done waiting. The questions started coming then. Not angry ones. Quiet ones. When did my boy stop seeing his father and start seeing a burden? When did the family his mother and I built begin to come apart at the joints? Because furniture and families are the same that way. They don't break all at once, they loosen. A joint works free a little at a time, season after season, and you don't notice until the day you lean on it and the whole thing gives. So I sat there and I let myself go back and find the first loose joint. It was 2 years back, the week after the funeral. The house Maggie and I had built, the one I'd paid off with 30 years of sweat, felt like a cave. Grant sat with me on the porch holding my hand, his eyes red. "Dad, you can't stay out here by yourself. All these memories, the yard's too much for you now. Come stay with us. Please. I can't stand the thought of you rattling around alone." And his wife stood behind him nodding, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and I believed every bit of it. I saw my little boy scared of losing the last parent he had. And in my grief I grabbed onto that family like a man going under grabs a rope. So I packed a few things, and I locked up the house I'd built with my own 2 hands, and I moved into their back bedroom. The drift started small. A few weeks in, Colleen came to me with a worried face and a piece of paper. "Russell, the property taxes on this place this year, I don't know how we're going to swing it. And I was a father, and fathers fix things, so I wrote a check and felt useful for the first time since the funeral." A month later it was my son sighing over a beer, talking about a slow stretch at the dealership where he worked, money tight, just till commissions picked back up. So I covered the groceries that month, then the next. Then came the talk about the joint account. Colleen laid it out like she was doing me a favor. "It just makes everything simpler. Have your Social Security and your pension direct deposited into our household account, and you're contributing automatically, and we don't have to keep having these awkward little money conversations." Lord, I was tired of awkward money conversations. I was tired down to my bones, so I signed where she pointed. Sitting in that motel chair 2 years later, the pieces clicked into place and I felt sick. Her tears at the funeral hadn't been for my grief. They'd been for their mortgage. The slow stretch at the dealership was just the cover story for getting their hands on a man's whole retirement. They hadn't invited me into their family. They'd acquired me, the way you acquire a piece of equipment. I wasn't a father being looked after. I was a checking account that snored down the hall. But it wasn't only the money. The money was clean by comparison. You can count money. The other thing they took from me was harder to add up, and it came back to me that night in sharp little pictures. The afternoon Colleen had a designer over and they walked through, staging the house to sell someday, and she gestured at the cherry side table I'd made for Maggie's 40th birthday, dovetailed by hand, finished with 11 coats of oil rubbed in over a month, and called it Russell's little hobby stuff. We'll donate most of it. A little hobby. 40 years of a trade people drove from Nashville to commission, and she'd donate most of it. There was the night the new thermostat went on the wall, the one you run from a phone, and I couldn't get the temperature to hold, and Grant took the phone out of my hand the way you take scissors from a toddler and said, real slow, "Dad, you just tap here, see? It's not complicated." A man who could read a moisture meter and tell you within a season how a board would move, being talked down to about a thermostat. And Colleen patting my arm. "He's just better with the tech, Russell. Don't trouble yourself." There was the Sunday I put on a Bill Withers record, the one Maggie and I used to play while she cooked, and Colleen drifted in with her nose wrinkled and asked if we could put on something that doesn't sound so depressing, and lifted the needle before I could open my mouth. And the silence after was worse than her words. Every single time my son had been right there, not standing up for me, smoothing it over, repackaging the insult as a joke, choosing his wife's mood over his father's dignity, again and again, until I'd shrunk down into exactly the harmless, useless old man they needed me to be so they wouldn't feel bad about what they were doing. My phone sat face up on the motel desk, dark. Something in me said, stop remembering and start checking. I picked it up and opened my banking app, and I don't even know what I was looking for. My checking account was where it always was, lower than it should be, but I knew where that had gone. Then I saw a line underneath it I'd never paid attention to. Linked accounts, and under that a home equity line of credit. Against my house. The house I'd paid off. The house they'd had me move into a family trust the year before for estate planning, Colleen said, so the kids wouldn't have to deal with probate someday. My chest went tight. I tapped it, and the statement loaded, and the breath went out of me. $41,300 some odd dollars drawn against a house I'd built with my hands and burned the mortgage papers on at my own kitchen table. And it wasn't repairs. It was a cruise to Cozumel. It was a designer handbag that cost more than my first truck. It was a sectional sofa, a kitchen renovation, a watch, page after page after page, and the dates were the part that turned my stomach to stone. The cruise was booked the same week my son sat across from me with that hangdog look telling me money was tight. The handbag was charged the month Colleen cried over property taxes and I wrote the check. The grief I'd carried into that motel room evaporated. What rose up in its place was cold and clear and very, very steady. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family being short on cash. This was theft. My signature, my house, my name, used like a tool they'd found in a drawer. They hadn't seen a father. They'd seen a line of credit with a heartbeat. And here's the strange thing. The grieving man who'd walked into that room died right there in the chair, and the craftsman woke up. The man who looks at a broken thing and doesn't cry over it and doesn't smash it. The man who measures it and finds the joint that failed and figures out exactly how to make it right. I closed the app, and I sat very still, and I started to draw up a plan in my head, the way I draw up a build, joint by joint. The phone buzzed in my hand. Her name on the screen. My son's, but I knew his wife was the one dialing. And under it a little red number that made me let out a low whistle in that empty room. 22 missed calls. A week's worth. 11 texts. A week earlier that would have had me panicking. Is the boy hurt? Is something wrong? I'd have answered on the first ring with my heart in my throat. But I wasn't that man anymore. I looked at those 22 calls and I felt nothing but a quiet kind of clarity. Those calls weren't about whether I was all right. They were 22 demands to know where their walking ATM had wandered off to. They were panicking because the HELOC payment was coming due, and the man who'd been quietly covering their whole counterfeit life had vanished, and the card was probably getting declined at the nail salon. My thumb hovered over the green button out of pure 40-year habit. I could almost hear the voice she'd put on. "Russell, we've been worried sick. Where are you?" A performance. And I was finally walking out of the theater. I pressed the side of the phone instead, knocked the ringer to silent, turned it face down on the desk, and watched the light die against the wood. For 2 years I'd answered every time they called. Now they could wonder. Now they could sit in the quiet I'd handed them. I wasn't a supporting character in their drama anymore. I was the one holding the pencil. Next morning I put on the navy suit. Felt strange on my shoulders after 2 years of those shapeless cardigans, but it settled in like an old friend. And that's exactly what it was. Armor. My oldest friend in this world is a lawyer named Warren, and his office sits downtown in a brick building that's been there since before either of us was born. Warren did our wills, Maggie's and mine. He sat at our kitchen table the night we signed them, eating her pound cake, all three of us laughing about a future none of us could see straight. He didn't shake my hand when I came in. He hugged me hard, the way men our age finally learned to. "Russell," he said, "sit down, talk to me." I told him everything, the kitchen, the ultimatum, the 2 years of quiet cuts. And then I laid the printed statements on his desk, the HELOC, the trust paperwork, all of it. I told it flat and steady, the way I'd describe a foundation that had failed, not because I didn't feel it, but because I'd learned that the feeling doesn't help you fix the thing. Warren put on his reading glasses and went through every page, slow. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper. When he finally looked up, the warmth was gone out of his face, replaced with something harder. "Russell," he said, "I want to be real clear with you about what this is, because it's important you hear it from a lawyer and not just a friend. This is not a family squabble. Drawing $41,000 against your home on a line of credit you didn't authorize, on a deed you were maneuvered into signing into a trust. In this state, that's not just elder financial abuse, which it surely is. It's fraud and identity theft, plain and simple. If a stranger off the street had done this, you'd already be looking at felony charges." He took the glasses off and rubbed his eyes. "You got two roads here. The first one, the one I'd recommend as your attorney, is we walk this file straight to the district attorney's office. The DA in this county does not take kindly to people who rob their own parents. They would press charges. Your son and his wife could be looking at real time." He let that sit. "And I want to tell you, the picture of my boy in a courtroom in a county jumpsuit, it turned my stomach inside out. Whatever he'd let himself become, I'd taught him to ride a bike and tie his shoes in sand with the grain. The second road," Warren went on, watching me, "is we treat it as a civil matter for now. We use this evidence as a crowbar. We freeze their access. We make them pay back every dime, and we cut them off from you and your assets permanently and legally. But we keep the cuffs in our pocket." I looked out his window at the courthouse across the square, at a building I'd actually done restoration work on 20 years back, and I thought about my wife. Filing on him would break Maggie's heart. "Even gone," I said quietly. "She'd haunt me for it. He's still my son. I don't want to be the one who puts that on his record forever." "Then what do you want, Russell?" Warren leaned back. "Because this isn't really about the money. You and I both know you've got enough to be all right. So what is it?" I thought about it a good long while. "I want them to understand," I said finally, "what they actually did, not the dollar amount. The thing underneath it. I've spent my whole life building pieces that outlast me, built to be passed down, built so a man's grandkids would set their coffee on something he made with love. They took a life like that, and treated it like spare change to fund a cruise. I don't want to burn their house down. I want to teach them what they threw away. I want it to cost them the right thing." Warren smiled, slow. "Maggie always said you were more of a teacher than a tradesman." He picked up his phone. "All right, let's draw up a lesson. First thing, we freeze it all. I'll call the bank within the hour, freeze the HELOC. I'll call the bank within the hour, freeze the HELOC, freeze the joint account, flag the trust pending a fraud review. They're cut off as of today. Second thing, I draft a demand letter, full repayment in 60 days, or we proceed to the DA. Time for these two to remember who built the thing they've been living off of." I walked back to the motel that day, not like a man who'd been thrown out, but like a man holding a fresh set of drawings. And here's the part I want you to understand, because it's the part that saved me. For 2 years, I'd let myself become nothing but Maggie's widower and Grant's wallet. I'd forgotten there was a whole life out there that had nothing to do with either of them, so I took out my old address book, Maggie's handwriting on half the names, that beautiful slanted script, and I started making calls. I called Lou up in Knoxville, who I'd apprenticed under 60 years ago when I was a smart-mouthed kid who didn't know a mortise from a hole in the ground. We didn't talk about my troubles once. We argued about whether you should ever use a power sander on old-growth oak. He says never. I say it depends. And for 40 minutes, I wasn't a discarded old man. I was a craftsman, talking the only language I ever really spoke fluent. I called a young woman named Priya. I trained years back, running her own shop in Asheville now, and I gave her advice on a commission and felt the old fire light back up in my chest. Each call was another board plan true. I was rebuilding myself, joint by joint. The last call I made that day was to an old friend named Otis, who'd who'd hung up his tools and gotten himself onto the landmarks preservation board for the city. We caught up, and then his voice went sour. "Russell, you seen what they're trying to do to the old Lyric?" The Lyric. I felt something move in me. The Lyric Theater on Carver Street, the grand old movie palace where Maggie and I had our first date in 1962, where half the folks on the east side of town had their first kiss and saw their first show, the one building everybody our age held in their heart. "No," I said careful. "Tell me." They finally got the funding to restore her. Problem is the front runner to do the interior. All the millwork, the seating, the box fronts, the lobby, is some flashy design firm that wants to gut the original craftsmanship and replace it with laminate reproductions made in a factory in another state. Veneer over particle board, glue and staples. They'll make it look right in the photos and it'll fall apart in 15 years. And get this, the woman fronting the bid runs that staging company. Calder Pruitt, they call themselves. My blood went still. Calder Pruitt was Colleen's firm. I kept my voice level. "Who's deciding it?" "That's the one bright spot," Otis said. "The director of the whole preservation trust, the deciding voice on the contract. It's your girl. Your old apprentice. Della Monroe." I had to sit down. Della Monroe, she hadn't just been a student. She'd been the best I ever taught, a girl from the east side who came into my shop at 16 with hands that already knew things mine had taken decades to learn. Maggie adored her. "That child's got steel in her spine and gold in her heart," my wife used to say. "She's going to do big things." And here she was, grown, running the trust that held the fate of the Lyric and of my daughter-in-law's whole counterfeit bid in her hands. I thanked Otis and hung up and sat in that motel room while the light went gold and then gray, and for the first time in 2 years I felt a slow smile spread across my face. The pieces were all there. The cheap operator, the sacred building, and a one person with the power to decide, who happened to be a woman I taught everything I knew about the difference between something built to sell and something built to last. It was a design problem of perfect, terrible symmetry. I found Della's number in Maggie's handwriting and I dialed. "Monroe speaking." "Della," I said, "it's Russell Doyle." There was a beat of silence and then her voice broke wide open. "Mr. Doyle." "Oh my lord. I was just thinking about you. We're restoring the Lyric and I keep telling everybody we ought to dig up whatever you've got in your head and just do that." We talked a good while. About her boys, about her shop days, about Maggie. She got quiet talking about my wife. "She taught me how to be a woman in a room full of men who didn't want me there," Della said. "You taught me joinery. She taught me everything else." That gave me the foundation I needed to build on. I steered it gentle toward the theater. I told her Otis had been bragging about the work she was doing, and I said the Lyric deserved hands that understood it wasn't just a building, it was the memory of a whole community. I didn't say one word about laminate or about Colleen. I just talked about what a real restoration owes to the people who'll never know your name, but will feel, somewhere in their chest, that something was done right. And Della, sharp as ever, went quiet, and then she said, "Mr. Doyle, the final bids are next week. I want you there, not bidding, as a consultant, as the trust's expert. Sit with the board, hear the proposals, and tell us the truth about what we're being sold. Your name in this town carries more weight than any firm's. Would you do that for the Lyric?" The plan had built itself, and she'd handed me the last beam. I let out a slow breath like I had to think about it. "For you, Della," I said, "and for that old theater, I'd be honored." The board met in the council chamber down at City Hall, all dark wood and high windows and the kind of hush that makes people whisper. Della arranged for me to wait in a small side room with a window onto the floor where I could watch and not be seen. I was the ghost in the wall, waiting for my cue. I spotted my daughter-in-law right off. Colleen stood near the front in a suit that cost too much and fit too tight, working the room, laughing one notch too loud at a board member's joke. She wasn't preparing. She was performing. Confidence worn like a coat off the rack, and in the second row sat my son, beaming up at his wife like she'd already won, in his good shirt, the one I'd bought him. The board filed in, and Della took the center chair, calm as still water, and let the room come to order. Colleen got up to present. Her slides were beautiful. Gorgeous renderings of the restored Lyric, the velvet, the gilt, the grand staircase. She talked about honoring the legacy, and an elevated guest experience, and cost-efficient heritage solutions, which is a string of words that means we're going to fake it. The seats in her renderings were reproductions stamped out by the thousand. The box fronts that craftsman had carved by hand 100 years ago, she'd have ripped out and replaced with molded resin painted to match. She taught for 20 minutes and never once said the word wood. When she finished, there was that polite, scattered clapping, and the board chair turned to Della. "Director Monroe, any questions?" Della leaned into her microphone, and the temperature of the room dropped about 10 degrees. "A lovely presentation," she said. "I'm curious about your interior millwork. You've budgeted to replace the original carved box fronts and the proscenium detailing. Those were done by hand in 1928 by local craftsmen, some of whose grandchildren are in this room. Can you point me to where in your bid you preserve any of that original work, rather than discard it for factory reproductions?" Colleen's smile pulled tight. Our reproductions are virtually indistinguishable and far more cost-effective." "Virtually indistinguishable to a camera," Della said. "Not to a hand. Not in 20 years. Your bid specifies particle board cores with a veneer skin throughout. In a building with the humidity swings of an unconditioned historic theater, what's your projected service life on that before it delaminates?" Colleen had no answer. She talked about industry standards and value engineering, and it was just noise, and everybody in that room could hear it was noise. Della let her hang there a moment, then folded her hands. "Thank you. That's very clarifying." She turned to the board. "What we've been shown is a proposal that talks about legacy and delivers a stage set. It honors the lyric, the way a costume honors a person, and it reminds me of everything my own teacher spent his whole life warning against." She paused. "Which is why I asked him here today." Colleen, trying to recover, gave a little dismissive laugh. "And who exactly is this teacher?" Della smiled, slow and dangerous, the way I taught her to smile right before she made a perfect cut. "A man whose opinion this board deserves to hear. I'd like to welcome Master Craftsman Russell Doyle." The side door opened and I walked in. Navy suit, chisels left at home, but the steel of them still in my spine. I heard the murmur ripple through the older folks who knew the name. I did not look at my daughter-in-law. I did not look at my son. But I felt them. I felt the whole room turn, and out of the corner of my eye I saw Colleen's face go slack and white as raw pine, her mouth open with nothing coming out. In the second row, my boy had his hand pressed over his lips, his eyes wide, finally understanding that this was no coincidence. This was a reckoning. I gave Della a small nod and stood at the front and faced the board. "Thank you for having me," I said. "Now, you've all just seen some very pretty pictures. Sleek, professional, expertly made, but I want to tell you what they actually are. They're an advertisement for tearing out the soul of this building and selling you the photograph of it. I learned my trade from men who learned it from the men who built that theater. I've had my hands on the original box fronts at the Lyric. There's a craftsman's pencil mark still under the gilt on the left proscenium, a little tally where he counted his courses. A man who's 70 years in his grave left a piece of himself in that wood, and you are being asked to throw it in a dumpster and replace it with glue and sawdust pressed into the shape of his work. Anybody with a catalog can buy a chair. It takes a craftsman to build something that outlives the hands that made it. A real restoration doesn't ask what's cheapest. It asks what we owe to the people who built it, and to the kids who will have their first kiss in that balcony 50 years from now, the way some of us did. You can fake the look of love, you cannot fake the fact of it. And in 15 years, when the veneer is peeling and the resin's cracked, this city will know exactly which one it bought." I looked at the board. Every one of them. "You've been shown a bid that'll save you money this year. I'm asking you to count what it costs and everything that matters. That's all I came to say." The silence when I finished wasn't polite. It was the heavy kind, the kind that comes after a truth nobody can argue with, and in that silence I watched the future my daughter-in-law had been so sure of come apart at every joint. I didn't wait for the vote. I nodded to Della, and I walked out the side door into the concrete cool of the parking garage, my footsteps echoing. I was halfway to my truck when I heard them. Dad, please wait." I stopped. I let myself take one breath, to put the father who'd have run to that sound back in his box, and let the craftsman stay holding the tools. Then I turned around. They came hurrying across the oil-stained concrete, my son's good shoes slapping, Colleen wobbling in her heels, both of them undone. Her makeup was streaked. His face was gray. "Dad, we can explain," he started. "My career is finished," Colleen cut in, her voice cracking. "Do you understand what you just did? That contract was everything. The whole firm." There it was. Not one word about what they'd done to me. just panic over what was coming to them. Their whole plea was a monument to themselves. I let them run out of breath. When they finally stood there empty, two grown people looking like lost kids, I reached into the folder under my arm. I took out the stack of papers Warren had drawn up, and I handed them not to her, but to my son. "What is this?" he whispered. "That's a repayment agreement," I said, "for $41,380 you two drew against the house your mother and I built on a line of credit I never authorized. Page 2's every charge, itemized. Page 5's the signature line." I looked between them. "You've got two choices. 1. You sign it. You sell that sectional, that watch, whatever you have to, and you pay back every dollar in 60 days, and we never speak of it again. 2. You don't sign, and tomorrow morning at 9, that whole file and my sworn statement go to the district attorney, and then it's not a family matter anymore. It's a felony. Your call." They stared at it like it might bite. Then I added the last part, gentle, just stating a fact. "And the house is coming out of that trust and going on the market at the end of the month. My attorney's already filed." Colleen looked up, gray. "Where are we supposed to live?" I looked at my daughter-in-law, and then at my son, and I'm telling you, I felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, just done. "That," I said, "is no longer my concern. The money from the house is going into a fund, the Margaret Doyle Apprenticeship, to teach kids in the East Side a trade so they grow up knowing how to build something that lasts. Something none of you ever bothered to learn." And I turned and walked to my truck and left them standing under those flat garage lights, holding the blueprint of their own undoing. 3 months can change the whole shape of a life. The leaves turned and dropped, and so did everything that had been weighing me under. They signed the agreement. They didn't have a choice, and the shame of it keeps them quiet. The house sold to a young family with 2 little ones who will wear out the floors making new dents, and that's exactly right. I rent a place now on the 3rd floor with windows that face east, because I chose it for the morning light. My bench is set up under the biggest one, and it's covered in shavings, and the whole place smells like cut cherry and linseed oil and coffee, and not one soul on this earth can tell me to clean it up. It's not a back bedroom, it's a shop. It's a life, and every square foot of it is mine. I was at the bench planing a board for a cradle, a commission, my first in 2 years, when the phone rang, and for half a second my chest tightened out of old habit. Then I saw the name. Della Monroe. "Russell," she said. No hello, just lit up. 2 things. 1, the board voted this morning, unanimous. Calder Pruitt's bid is dead. The lyric is not getting laminated. "That's good news, Della," I said. "That's not the good news." I could hear her grinning. "We're starting the restoration over from scratch, the right way, and the board approved the budget to bring you on as master craftsman and lead consultant. The whole thing, Russell. The box fronts, the millwork, all of it under your hands. The lyric is yours, if you still want it." I looked around my little shop. The light pouring in, the cradle taking shape on my bench, the photo of Maggie in her yellow dress propped up where I could see it while I worked. For 2 years, my whole world had shrunk down to one beige room in a house where I wasn't wanted. Now it was opening back up, wide as the morning. "Della," I said, and my voice came out thick, "it would be my honor." I hung up and stood at the window a while. For a long time I'd let other folks tell me who I was. Maggie's widower, Grant's father, Colleen's problem. I'd forgotten the man who could stand in front of a rough plank and see the thing it was meant to become. That man was still here. He'd just been buried under other people's idea of him. Here's what I learned, and it's the only thing I really came on here to say. Your worth doesn't shrink just because the people closest to you stop seeing it. For too long, I confused taking care of my family with handing them a blank check on my own dignity. Loving your children was never supposed to mean letting them sand you down to nothing. The finest thing I ever built wasn't a table or a box front or a theater. It was the line I finally drew, plumb and square and true, around my own peace. And the strongest move I ever made wasn't shouting. It was packing one old bag and walking out quiet, knowing my own value didn't need their permission. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, tell me about it down in the comments. I read every one. I keep coming back to that smile I gave Colleen across the dinner table, because it surprised me as much as it surprised her. For 2 years I'd swallowed every little cut, and I'd told myself that swallowing was the same as keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was just teaching them, one quiet meal at a time, that there was no bottom to what I'd take. People will measure you by the lines you let them cross, and I'd erased every line I had. The day I stopped erasing them, Everything changed. Not because I got loud, but because I finally got clear. Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting walked on. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way a good joint works. Loose, one season of pretending, then another, until the whole thing gives under a weight it should have carried easy. I let Grant talk me out of my own house. I let Colleen talk me into a joint account. A trust. A signature I didn't read close enough. Every single time, I chose the comfort of not arguing over the harder work of paying attention, and the cost of not paying attention came due to the tune of $41,000 drawn against the home I built with my own hands. That wasn't bad luck, that was the bill for 2 years of looking away. What pulled me out wasn't anger, though I had plenty. It was deciding to use my head instead of my hurt. When I found those statements, I didn't drive over there and break a window. I drove to Warren's office and I built a case, joint by joint, the way I'd build anything meant to hold, choosing the courtroom over the wrecking ball, choosing a repayment agreement over a screaming match. That was me refusing to let their worst behavior pull the worst out of me. You can win and still keep your hands clean. Most folks never learn that. And none of it would have mattered if I'd let myself believe I was finished. The hardest part wasn't outsmarting Colleen at that board meeting. It was picking up the phone and dialing Della and Lou and the old crew and remembering I was still a craftsman, still somebody, after 2 years of being treated like furniture nobody wanted. Walking back into that life took more grit than walking out of that house ever did. So if you take anything from an old man, take this. Guard your dignity early, while the lines are still easy to draw, because they only get harder. When somebody wrongs you, answer with a clear mind, not a hot one. It costs you less and protects you more. And on the days the world has decided you're done, decide for yourself that you're not, and then go prove it with your hands. Your worth was never theirs to set. It was always yours to keep.